Hello and welcome. My name is Drew.
And I'm Eric.
And we are the Provisionist Perspective. Today, Eric's going to take me on a little bit of a journey. I'm not sure quite what to expect.
You should be afraid. Very, very afraid. This comes from a bit of an existential church crisis. Again, yeah, hello, everybody. We're live. This is alive. And I do want to interact with our beautiful Provisionist Perspective audience. The brand of you know what I mean. This is the kind of interaction.
Oh, we clicked one at the same time.
Let's
the new brand of gel he's using.
First of all the comments about my hair every time we do a live, I don't know if I appreciate it or what that's all about. My dad called it the Hallmark hair. That I look like that I'm a lumberjack in some small town who's going to persuade the professional girl from the big city to slow down and start a family.
Nice. This is my buddy Zeke, by the way, from back home. He says, "Woo, let's get this party started." He's going to do dinner and put the baby down.
That's the baby's sleep schedule. Don't you do that?
I need to do something right quick. By the way, I need to do something. It's probably wax or something. Is it?
It's
waxed?
It's a.
Don't answer that. Don't answer that. Yeah, I had to do that. I had to throw our new intro up there. Carry on, sorry.
It's a fiber.
Our viewership's dropping off, by the way. We gotta crack into this. This is
two people have left. If they don't like the hair talk, I don't know. Talking about so this has started as a bit of come from a bit of an existential crisis, and I think that you can relate to this, Drew, and I hope audience can too. Where we like the church we're going to. Okay, we've been on a little bit of a journey here in Texas, finding a church. And by journey, I mean we've gone to two churches. I don't know what I'm talking about, but that the second church we're going to start serving there and everything like that. Our background checks are in, and we're going to start serving there and everything. But so it's not I'm not saying we're going to leave this church because of this stuff, but it's a bit of a evangelical church existential crisis here, where what kicked us off, and this isn't I'm trying to do this justice here. This isn't a one-time thing, but it's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, and made my wife and I, really, this has been a conversation between my wife and I, that we're like, are we kind of getting everything the church has to offer for us? Is this where it's at? As far as traditions go and how we worship God and how we talk about Him, where our church was brave and started doing a series on death, which was cool. We only had a coffin on the stage. It's great. And but during it, one of the themes is what you believe about the there and then affects how you live in the here and now, right? And that's true. But then as he goes on to describe that, one of the preachers, one of the pastors on the teaching team, good guy, good preacher, but he said something that set us off down this, where he said that the point of being a Christian is to become a little Jesus Junior. You're like a Jesus Junior.
Yeah.
And that was so irreverent. That was too irreverent for me. And it was like kind of one of those youth group things that you say.
Yeah.
And then it doesn't leave your vocabulary, and now you're saying it in church. Jesus Junior. And it's like, is this really?
He's probably former youth pastor too. So
yeah, exactly. So is this really how we should be doing this? Is this what other preaching traditions? Yeah, like Mini-Me, right? He might as well have done that impression. What other kind of traditions and ways of
his character?
That's right. What other kind of traditions and things are there out there? And I've been listening to NT Wright lately, and I thought no better place would be to do this with you, Drew, and to do this with all of you, is to work through NT Wright together. That let's get introduced to, is this guy really all that crazy? Are Reformed, the other aspect of this is this, and then I'll stop talking. that's not true. I'll keep talking, but I'll pause. I'll pause after this. Is our Reformed brothers and sisters want to tell us that NT Wright is crazy and that we shouldn't listen to him. And I'll admit that there's some triggering things for me here. He's Anglican. He's preaching at Fuller. I'm a little bit, I'm already triggered. As a Biola guy, Fuller, kind of thing. But I want, that's the central question is, does he sound crazy? And I don't know if I agree with everything. We can work this out together, but does he sound nuts? And what do we do with this? And should we not let the Reformed tell us who we should listen to and incorporate some of this into our critiques and into our theology and how we talk about this stuff? So your thoughts, Drew, before we start.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think I've read a little bit of NT Wright. He's a bit of a meanderer. I read his Surprised by Hope. I think I got probably about a third of the way through it just before my grandpa passed away, actually. So it was an interesting time to be reading something like that and having some of my thinking shifting on that. But, and it was quite shaping that book in terms of shaping my thinking and my vocabulary surrounding what it means to have everlasting life, what it means to, I try to avoid words like going to heaven and stuff like that. So, but I guess he's surrounded by a little bit of controversy and stuff like the New Perspective on Paul. And so
this is about Pauline. This is about his Paul and Justification book. His Paul and the Justification of God book, and it's a series of lectures he's doing on this. And he makes his case. It's a cursory thing. Again, we're just starting with this, and maybe we'll do some more of these and look at this whole lecture series that he does. It looks like it was a conference at Fuller, and this is the introductory, talk. And hopefully we'll get through half of it. I'm hoping about half of it here, and we'll see. This is the Pauline theology stuff that he's kind of mired in controversy, and he responds to some of this controversy here. And that's the kind of stuff he does that about halfway through. And I want to try to get to there where he responds, because I feel like if we adopt some of this, it'll really help us in our critique of Calvinism. And it may help us to avoid some of the irreverent Jesus Jr. kind of talk as to what it is, what the transformative gospel is all about, and what we're supposed to do. But
as a sidebar, while I'm getting this set up, by the way, do you want me to just start it from the beginning and then we'll just play it and then we're going to talk through it, or you have timestamps that you want to start?
I've got some timestamps here, but from the beginning is yes.
As a sidebar, I think I've begun to take umbrage with my own personal and other people's usage of the word reformed to describe Calvinistic soteriology, because reformed is a very large umbrella. And it seems to me, and we don't have to go into this, but it seems to me as though Calvinism and Calvinist is like this word that people don't like to say, myself included. It's kind of, I don't know what it is. It's, and so then you use this reformed theology, kind of stuff instead of just saying Calvinism. And so I think I've wanted to start being a little bit more precise, and you, by all means, continue using reformed theology. This isn't a critique of you or anything, but maybe
I'll say what I want, Drew. Thank you very much.
Expanded on a different. We have thoroughly established that. That's for sure. So what timestamp do you want me to start at?
Well, what if let's see if I can do.
Or you can put it up there. It might be easier. I don't know if you want to control it.
Is that looking good?
Yep. Looks good. Good. I can close my screen.
Very good to be in a location like this. I always get nervous when I realize that half of you may be looking at me on the big screens behind. And many times I've been doing this, I get this sort of sense, I wonder what I look like on that screen. The trouble is, if you try to see, then it's one of those.
You're right. It's a funny guy.
You see when you look to see what you look like is the back of your own head. I have a feeling Jacques Derrida may have said something about that. I'm not sure. Anyway, we're talking about Paul this week. When as a bishop, I take upon myself to talk about Paul, I'm always reminded of the bishop, I can't remember which one it was, who said plaintively, everywhere St. Paul went, there was a riot. Everywhere I go, they serve tea. And we might ask ourselves, what have we done to domesticate Paul to avoid the riots and sip the tea instead? What has happened to the explosive, dramatic Pauline gospel if studying it now becomes a leisure activity for those who like that kind of thing, to be fitted in between going for a jog and watching our favorite TV program? What was it in the first place that made Paul say what he said and made what he said the focus of so much anger and fear and produced so many riots and beatings and stonings and all the rest of it? Now, Paul knew none better that his gospel was bound to be seen as dangerous nonsense. We need to remind ourselves of that from time to time, because those of us who grew up in the church and those of us who've known and loved the gospel and have worshipped together for a long time often take it for granted that this is a fairly sensible thing to believe because it's what we've ordered our lives by. But it hits you in the face when you think what it was like for Paul arriving in Philippi or Thessalonica or Corinth or wherever it was. I was reminded of this a few years ago.
So he gives kind of a story here as an aside, and we can skip over that. But that's sort of his main question, his main idea here, and is what was it like for Paul to be preaching the gospel, and why was it that it led to so many riots, whereas to now it doesn't? Does that sound crazy so far?
No, I think he makes a really good rhetorical point that why is it that when Paul preached or talked about the gospel that there were riots, and when I preach, people serve tea? Maybe we've lost some of the controversy, if you will, of Paul's gospel. It sounds, to my fundy ears, it sounds weird to say Paul's gospel.
Yeah,
I get what he's saying.
He slips in and out of this academic speak that you kind of just have to go into, where he's going to say Paul's gospel, and just what he means is, there's a distinction between Johannine theology and Pauline theology, and this is the terms they use, Petrine, right? Theology for Peter.
Yeah.
And that's, he just means to have that distinction because he is an academic, I think, and can't really remove that from his vocabulary. And that's kind of what I mean. Is this? I listened to NT Wright, and I know that the words Jesus Jr. aren't going to come out of his mouth, and so while,
fair enough.
Right. So while I don't really quite understand what it is to be a bishop in the Anglican Church, I know that I probably disagree with a lot of Anglican Church. I don't have the experience of an Anglican liturgy or really the capacity to compare it to an evangelical liturgy, if you can call it that. But liturgy, but but at least he's not talking like that about Jesus. I don't know.
Fair enough.
Yeah. So let's move on. He is, what he's going to be doing here. He's going to flesh out a little bit more about what he means by why it was so foolish to those. And how radical it was to some of his listeners, and so let's listen in here as he does that.
Grew up knowing about the Christian faith, as I say, may need reminding that this was what it was like when Paul arrived in a new town. The world has a new Lord, and he's called Jesus. What are you talking about? He was crucified. Excuse me, but God raised him from the dead. Oh, for goodness sake, give us a break. You must be crazy. Now he's in charge of the whole world, and he's wanting us to join in with what he's doing in his new way of life. Every line in that announcement is either nonsense or it's scandalous, or both. And when it becomes clear that for Paul, this message will mean giving up some of the major symbols of your own world, particularly your regular trips to the various temples for festivals, for fun of various sorts, and for prayer in time of distress, in order to make sure that the city and the community are protected against possible dangers, you're going to have to give up all of that because those aren't gods there, they're non-gods, and they're bad for your health. Don't go near them. There's a new way of worshiping, a new way.
What kinds of things? This is so challenging because what kinds of things do we as Christians actually give up when it comes to our culture? I mean, we individually might give up certain things and say, yeah, I'm not really going to do Disney Plus. I'm not going to watch HBO. There are things that I'm just not going to know about that go on in the culture. But why? But as a whole, what is the artifact of our culture that we don't participate in that would sound crazy to those who are outside of the church? Can you think of one?
No, and maybe that's a problem. Yeah. I mean, there's the, Christians do seem to often be known for what they don't do rather than what they do. So there's kind of like the don't smoke, don't get drunk, don't watch pornography or sexually explicit shows or whatever.
We do those things. We do those things. There is no mechanism that the church employs to kick out those who do such things.
Yeah, there is a mechanism called church discipline, which hopefully we'll get around to covering one day.
Nobody does.
Nobody does. And when you get kicked out of a church, or however you want to say that, disciplined, excommunicated, so on, they just go to another church in town. They just start attending a different church. And that's not a good thing. That's not good for their soul. It's not good for the health of the body of Christ. But getting in people's business and ringing up another church and being like, by the way, we heard that such and such is attending. We just wanted to let you know that is that's spicy. Yeah.
So yeah, Tim, each Christian has their own convictions, but there are things that I'm premising this with, if we had a sort of functioning unity, and that doesn't mean ecumenical unity, it doesn't mean we agree on everything, but if we had some sort of unity of practice and unity of concern, then we wouldn't have our own, there would be certain things that we would all share. And even if I worship and it looks like this and you worship and it looks like this, that's fine. But we don't accept fornicators among us. We don't accept adulterers among us. We don't accept, these people have to go through a process first to come be a part of it. Those are just the examples that we're using here. I'm looking for anything. The church, by and large, I think this is a little bit of foreshadowing of what's to come in this channel, hopefully. I think by and large, the church just accepts divorce. We just, the covenant vow, we kind of basically view it the way our culture does. Yeah, it's good. You should stay married. It's fine. But if you really don't want to be in it, who am I to tell you what to do?
Yeah, and as soon as you take a firm, unapologetic stance on that issue, you got a congregation that's chock-a of, divorce, remarried couples and stuff like that. And so you're putting a stake in the ground and telling people, hey, you shouldn't have done that, and this is not It's not something that we do in our society. Yeah.
All right.
You guys didn't know we were going to be talking about divorce and remarriage today, did you? Neither did I.
So I have to do this first and then this. Got it.
But what are the neighbors going to think? This is dangerous nonsense. What will the authorities think? Might this be bad for business? In Philippi or Ephesus, at least, the answer was yes, this was bad for business. For all those reasons, people got worried and riots were likely. Oh, we don't want this kind of disruptive thing here, thank you very much. Folly to Gentiles, scandalous to Jews.
And just to give on the riots thing, my own soapbox, I'm gonna poke as many people in the eye as I can here, because that's the point of this. The point of this, right, is what was it about that Paul's gospel, the gospel that Paul was preaching, so to speak, that poked a bunch of people in the eye and caused riots? And was it about the church that so domesticated it that none of that happens when Christians are around now? When there were riots in the streets, it wasn't the Christians who were doing it because the governments were forcing them not to meet. It was the actual believers of their ideology who were in the streets burning stuff down and rioting. We saw that the summer 2020. It wasn't Christians who were doing anything to go against being shut down. And when the government told us that meeting at church and church was not essential, we just said, okay, yes, sir. And we didn't do anything controversial. Nobody was uncomfortable. Nothing uncomfortable happened when every single government in the West told every single Western church to shut down. Just saying.
Yeah. I'm not allowed to comment on that. What was I going to say though? One thing that I was thinking about the riots that happened is the socio-cultural context of that. And I wonder, I spent some time in India, as many of you know. There's a festival that happens once a year in the area that I lived in called Durga Puja. Wow, I can't say that.
Oof, that's a tough one.
And basically, there are these idols that get paraded, and you visit them, and they're kind of artistic, but it's also an idol that's just made of different stuff. It's sort of hard to explain. You can Google it. And you can imagine if followers of Jesus, believers in Christ, came in, and then suddenly there was a massive conversion such that, and there's so much money tied up in these idols and making these idols and stuff.
Yeah.
And they're just so expensive and stuff, such that people went, oh, well, we're not gonna do this anymore. We found the one true God, and we don't do this idol stuff anymore. There would be riots. So, I wonder, but we make a valid question. What is it that our faith, that the gospel, the good news of Jesus, should be upsetting in our society? And it doesn't seem like much. So,
and I want to do this a little bit here. Here we go. So, I stayed out of church involvement for years because of my own divorce. I found regular attendance almost impossible, despite the fact that I never wanted to get divorced. I'm hearing more and more stories like that, where there is no, and this goes along with this other comment here. And she's Claude. I don't know if it's a man or woman here, but I've been divorced for 20 years, and the church was an abject failure, no compassion, just judgment. So the church doesn't know how to do this at all. And divorce is something that is a failure, right? It is something that is violating a vow. It's breaking a vow, and it's awful. But at the same time, as NT Wright is going to go on to say, the gospel is a gospel of reconciliation. And so while there should be church discipline and telling the truth to the partner, the spouse who is seeking divorce, which by the way, that's 60% of the time, that's the wife, by the way. the partner who is seeking the divorce, 60% of the time, most of the time the wife, that there should be a speaking the truth to them and advising them not to, and bringing them before church discipline if they continue the divorce, that there should be compassion and reconciliation for the aggrieved party and for the offending party, because sometimes it's both, right? Both people are aggrieved and offended, and the offenders and the aggrieved. There should be compassion for them and a path to reconciliation, especially the reconciliation of the marriage, if that's still possible. More to come as we flesh that stuff out on this channel, but I agree with you that the church just has done very, very, very badly with all that. I wonder what it would look like for the church to take a stand on this in such a way that makes people in the culture really mad. Yeah.
But as Paul says in various places, to us, the gospel, the good news about Jesus, about a living God who has acted in Jesus, about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus as the turning point of history, the place where heaven and earth come together, do business at last, the place where the old world was condemned and the new world was born. This message carried its own power and, surprisingly, its own new wisdom. It generated a new way of thinking, a new way of knowing, and that power and that wisdom reached out. And even though people, when they first heard it, thought this is absolutely crazy, some people found that it went right deep down inside them and transformed them from top to bottom. And with that transformation, something new came into existence. Not just a new spirituality for individuals, no, a new community, a new way of life, a way of life radically different from anything any of them had known before. From the very beginning, Christianity wasn't an individual sport like table tennis. It was a team sport like rugby. You can't do reconciliation all by yourself. And that's what the gospel was about. It made, quite simply, a world of difference.
I love that you can't do reconciliation alone. It's not just about transforming you individual spirits, but about forming a new community.
Yeah, probably one thing that we sometimes unilateral forgiveness is important. Well, it's always important, but is the only route that you can take. But ultimately, forgiveness should be sought first through reconciliation, which involves two parties. And then if that's not possible, you just have to forgive somebody from your heart. But I guess what I'm saying is that we've made forgiveness into this personal decision, which it has to be that. But it's not just that. It has to involve, I mean, forgiveness can be unilateral. Reconciliation is not.
And he goes on right here to give an example of this looks like our side theme here a little bit is going to be divorce, which is fine. But as controversial as we would consider this idea that imagine the situation where a woman has been horribly emotionally abused by her husband, and then the elders in a church are given the biblical task of telling her that she still doesn't get to divorce, that she's still not justified in getting divorced. That's controversial. How many people are signing up for that task? How many church elders, how many people here listening to us now are signing up for...
I was just going to say that I think that ultimately what it comes down to is what people believe about divorce and remarriage.
That's exactly right.
If you believe that there are these exemption clauses that just permit you to be like, cool, yeah, rubber stamp it, divorce, see you later. Now this is different from separating and removing yourself
Sure.
from an abusive situation.
Sure.
These separation and
Of course.
divorce are different issues. Fortunately, we live in a modern society where separation is an option. That wasn't an option in the ancient world, as far as I understand it. But yeah.
So let's return to this. Let's let NT Wright give this really controversial example. Separation, I think, but again, a gospel of reconciliation, right? That if there is a system of church discipline that both are subject to, both parties in the marriage are subject to, then you're going to have,
Which there isn't.
Which there isn't. Well, let's say there is, because what you're going to do is you're going to hear me say that what you just heard me say was that even if a woman is emotionally abused, and men, let's be honest, who hasn't emotionally deeply hurt their wives? I mean, is that abuse? Some could make it so. What's the demarcating line here, right? Mm-hmm. Are we really going to go to kind of a modern secular psychological definition of what abuse is, and then say, yeah, anybody who's been abused in a marriage can go get a divorce? I don't think we want to go there. So let's take what you just heard me say, and this is my controversial example. We'll let NT Wright do it, and then we'll talk about it. My controversial example is a woman who's been, gaslit and abused by her husband, and her husband's like a narcissist or something like that. And the biblical task of the elders of the church is to tell her that she doesn't get to divorce. She can separate, remove herself from that situation, but she doesn't get to move on with her life. She made a vow to this man, and she has to stay with him. And you're going, oh, that's really tough. I don't know about that. Okay, yeah, but since there's a church discipline system in place that all the churches are using, right? You're bringing this dude up before church discipline if he doesn't stop. If he doesn't repent and put himself under teaching and discipleship and growth, he's going through church discipline, and that becomes public if he doesn't repent and turn from his behavior towards her. So there's a balance there, and now everybody's on board all of a sudden. So let's let NT Wright do it, and then we'll talk about this example, and then we'll talk about my example.
Is something much more subtle, much more indicative of the new birth which had come with Jesus the Messiah. We tend to go for the grand gesture. We love grand gestures in the Western world, particularly. Go on, Paul, we want to say. Tell him slavery is wicked. God is going to...
He's talking about Onesimus and Philemon and Philemon. Philemon? How do I say that? I don't know.
Philemon. I don't know.
And reconciling slaves. So instead of telling Paul outlaw slavery because it's wrong, Paul does something even more difficult.
To set them all free. Well, even if that had been possible, it wouldn't in fact have been as difficult as what Paul is asking of Philemon and also of Onesimus. Paul is asking that they be reconciled, not just that they tolerate each other, not just that they forgive one another at a distance, but of course you never need meet again. No. The gospel for runaway slaves is, first, the good news that God loves them so much that Jesus died for them, but it is, second, the news that the reconciliation they have found with the living God is also the reconciliation that must be put into effect with their brothers and sisters. That was hard for Philemon, it was hard for Onesimus, but it was central to the message and mission of Paul the Apostle.
So central to the mission of Paul the Apostle in our day would be that those who made a vow to one another don't get to abandon it just because their relationship looks less like a marriage and more like a slave and a slave owner. Even in that controversial situation where our sensibilities would want to tell Paul that slavery is wrong and we need to abandon the whole thing, and you need to tell Onesimus to Philemon. Onesimus was the slave. Philemon to give up his slave, and the whole thing is wrong. Paul tell him the whole system is wrong. He goes, no, you have to be reconciled to each other as master and slave. Are we getting controversial yet?
Yeah, I think, and I was going to say this earlier, and I'm glad that we can, parallel these things. Is what a beautiful picture of the gospel of someone sinning against you repeatedly, perhaps unrepentantly, and if need be, you're removing yourself for your own safety, but then you're waiting, you're holding out hope, you're pursuing, you're praying. You've got the church leadership involved. That's Jesus's love there. And in fact, well, I don't know if I want to tell this story on a public podcast, but let's just say that recently someone close to me admitted for the first time that they should not have gotten a divorce. And I thought, wow, that's actually really big for them to say that out loud after 40, 30 years. I don't know how long it was. But yeah, so I'm right there with you.
That is a much harder thing. And it would be much more countercultural.
I'm interested, by the way. This is and I see our brother, gosh, I'm blanking on your name. Brother Jordan, here in the side chat. And we've had some conversations about conditional security and once saved, always saved in some of the groups. And my view of God's relationship with us informs, in terms of the security of the believer, informs my view on marriage and divorce. And so I'm interested, Eric. Maybe one day when we get into this discussion further, we can talk more about that. But that's just a little bit of a sidebar, just a nugget for you guys to think on, which we can come back to later.
So in the next few minutes here, NT Wright explains what he means by this gospel of reconciliation. And again, these are categories that give me the heebies a little bit, and I'm not sure what to do with it. He's talking in categories that I'm not quite used to. He's not saying that this gospel of reconciliation is sort of a side theme of Paul or whatever. He's saying this is the central thing for Paul. This is what we should be talking about as the central Pauline idea, and everything else is secondary around it.
He calls his sorry to interrupt.
No.
He calls his in 2 Corinthians 5, I think it is. Yeah. He calls what he has been committed the ministry of reconciliation.
That's right. He quotes
his view of his own entire apostolic enterprise is the ministry of reconciliation. And I would like to think, in what NT Wright perhaps is going to go on to argue, and not listen to all of this, is that if this is the theme of Paul's gospel, then how much more should it be the theme of our lives of reconciliation stuff? Let me just tell a story. People like stories. I messaged a friend of mine recently. We lived and traveled and worked together in India, and I messaged her recently about something that the Lord got my attention on that I thought might have offended her. Our time in India didn't end that great. And so I messaged her just because I thought, man, this is, I feel quite challenged by this. My view, basically it was my view on women teaching. And so I had discouraged her from an opportunity to teach. And she ended up not taking that opportunity. And I messaged her about it. And I said, listen, my view on this has changed. I can see how that would have been hurtful, and I'm sorry. And she sent me this wonderful response apology for some other things and stuff. And I was just so like, wow, this is just beautiful. This is, things are great. This is what this should look like. And that's ministry of reconciliation, is actually taking that imagine taking Matthew 18, 15 to 20 or whatever, and actually doing what it says. when your brother or sister offends you, you go to them and them alone, and you have a conversation with them. Wow, that's shock horror that we might do that. But
Right.
sorry, carry on. That's a
Right.
little bit of a side story. So
You see this quite clearly if you contrast Paul's letter to Philemon with a letter by a near contemporary of his, Pliny the Younger. We've got a whole collection of Pliny's letters. He was an aristocrat, a lawyer, a politician, a senior civil servant in the imperial bureaucracy. And he had occasion to write to a friend, a social inferior, about a young man in trouble. Not an exact parallel to Philemon and Onesimus, but not too far off either. But when we put the two letters side by side, and this is how I start the book, see, I'm just getting the plug in from time to time, but so you know where we are. When we see them side by side, there are all sorts of subtle differences, which, when we think them through, give us a sharp little spotlight on Paul's gospel and the world of difference it made, and particularly on the question of why there was such a thing as Paul's theology. Why Paul invented something which, with hindsight, we can call Christian theology, and what that new intellectual discipline was designed to do. There isn't time to go into the details on Paul and Pliny. You'll have to look at the book for that. But let's just say that in Pliny's letter, nothing changes socially. Oh, he wants his friend to do the decent thing, to be kind after a fashion. But society is not changed. Everyone keeps their place in the social order. Whereas with Paul, something quite radical has happened. He stretches out one hand and says, here is Onesimus. He is my son, my very heart, my second self. And he stretches out the other hand and says, and you, Philemon, we are partners. We're in this gospel business together. You owe me your own very self anyway. I want a return on that investment. And as Paul in this letter reaches out to both of them, we see that though he doesn't explicitly mention the death of Jesus in this letter, he is enacting the death of Jesus and its reconciling power in his pastoral ministry. It's no surprise after reading Philemon to discover that when Paul describes his own vocation and ministry in 2 Corinthians, he speaks of it as being a ministry of the new covenant in which hearts are changed, 2 Corinthians 3 and 4, a ministry then of new creation in which nothing remains the same, 2 Corinthians 5, and above all, end of 2 Corinthians 5, the ministry of reconciliation. In a sense, it would have been much easier for Paul to tell Philemon, oh, by the way, I met that slave of yours, Onesimus, but he's gone away and I don't know where he is now. And Paul could have said to Onesimus, look, just push off, go off to Philippi. There's some nice people there. You need never come back here and then it'll be all much easier. No, that's not how the gospel demand works. The good news of God in the Messiah reconciling the cosmos to himself catches up all those who believe it in the imperative to work for reconciliation at every level. The gospel is good news for runaway slaves, but as with the rest of us, the good news which transforms us makes us, for precisely that reason, stand up straight and take responsibility for living out the gospel of reconciliation in a new way, in a new world, in the new world that God has launched in the Messiah.
Thoughts?
Here's my thoughts. We've already gone there, and we've already opened this can of worms. And at the risk, this divorce remarriage thing is just the topic that we're on, and I get that it's really sensitive. I'm reading some of the side chat over here, and
we done did it, Drew.
Yeah, and there's hurt. I have there's so much divorce in my own family. I mean, and it's interesting because actually here in New Zealand, among Christians, divorce is so much less heard of. Like, it's quite rare here, apparently, for that to happen. Much more rare. I don't know why that is. Don't ask me. But he talked about the ministry of reconciliation here. So let's say you're in a marriage and you're with an emotionally abusive wife, because that happens, right? It's not just the men. Women are sinners too. And so you have to separate yourself. You say maybe you even get divorced. The question regarding the gospel, the good news of Jesus, this ministry of reconciliation, is what does God want me to do? God wants you to be reconciled to your spouse, doesn't he? I mean, I don't know how that's not, and I guess you get into the question of is that possible? And I feel like that's a different question. Is that person responsive? But I don't know. Yeah. I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. And when I compare the gospel and Jesus's pursuit of me, God's pursuit of me in Christ continually, still to this day, I think, and then there are these passages that talk about marriage being like Christ and his bride and stuff. Isn't that what my marriage is supposed to look like? Isn't that what all of our marriages are supposed to look like? Is love and pursuit and forgiveness? And that it's messy, it's complex, and I'm not saying it's easy, but yeah.
Maybe this is the thing that the church should be about. The culture has a certain ethic, and the ethic is you can have sex with whoever you want. That's just a transaction for the pleasure of one or the other or both. And you can do that as much as you'd like. And there is no such thing as self-control. There is no such thing as not getting your sexual desires fulfilled, no matter what they are. And then when it comes to relationships, that relationships from girlfriend, boyfriend, dating to marriage are okay as long as they're mutually beneficial. But once they stop being mutually beneficial, they can be jettisoned for a new, more beneficial relationship. This is, as people are discussing, and I appreciate you guys being cordial and kind to each other here, and while at the same time telling your perspectives in our chat here as we can over a very controversial, very hurtful topic. Maybe this should be the central thing the church is about, because of how painful this is, how destructive to communities, churches, families, and children, especially, that divorce is. So maybe this should be where the church is. As much as Drew, how much of a raging conservative I am. And as much as I preach the gospel of conservatism to those who will listen to me, this is where the churches who are beholden too much to either political party, even the political party I mostly agree with, who are so in the bag that they talk about politics or what's going on culturally in politics every single Sunday. That's why that makes me uncomfortable. It's not because that's not important, but maybe it's not the most important thing. It's not the central thing, the central purpose the church should be promoting in the culture. Should be that's not where we should be focused. That there's something much more destructive that the church has seemingly been, unwilling to make a hard stance against.
Yeah, it's kind of like the stance is, we know that this is bad and we know that God doesn't want this, but we're not going to really get our hands dirty and get in here and really contend for this thing, is what it seems like. And then it's kind of, oh yeah, this happened, so well, let's forgive. And totally, no one's, and this is, to the point of divorce and remarriage. I think on the other side of the spectrum, there are groups and people that would have you wear a scarlet D or on your chest for the rest of your life. And I think that that's crazy and absurd and is not exhibiting the love and forgiveness of Christ.
Yeah, there's no chance for reconciliation.
Right. Well, yeah. So, anywho, I don't know where I was going with
But
that
if you, what you're saying is it seems to not be something that, okay, if the marriage vow isn't something that is, if the marriage vow is something that can be jettisoned when keeping it becomes just painful, then what grounds does any church have to stand on on sexual immorality of any kind? Why is sexual immorality wrong, if not because it violates divorce, because it is adultery and violates the marriage bed and all that? But if your church doesn't care about marriage, doesn't stand in the gap with couples who are in trouble, and doesn't make it one of your central things that you are about, then when it comes to other issues that are arguably downstream of divorce, like homosexuality, what leg do you have to stand on?
Yeah. I mean, you and I talked about this a little bit the other day. I don't remember how it came up, but we stand on this one thing and we, say, well, it's an abomination, this, that, and the other. But then meanwhile, we're largely just crickets over here about this issue that is just, it's uncanny how rampant it is. But yeah. There have actually been some statistics that have emerged recently, though, I think that because there was something about how evangelicals or something have a higher rate of divorce or something like that. And then there was a recent study that came out that sort of debunked that. I'll have to look into it.
I've looked into that. It's that if you take people, there's lies, there's damn lies, and there's statistics, right? So if you take people who go to church on a regular basis and are involved in some way, and this, by the way, this gets into what NT Wright says next. The divorce rate is minuscule. If you take people who have already been divorced, their rate of divorce, like a second and third time and stuff, skyrockets. They're going to do it again.
And it's interesting. Yeah. So you've got statistics that are largely based on members. Like you're on the roll.
Right. Exactly. But you don't go, you're not involved.
Yeah.
You're talking about religious people. Religious people stay together longer, have better sex, have happier lives than the people who kind of like go, but aren't, go once a month, kind of thing, and don't really, and that's anti-gospel, right? I mean, so here's what he goes on to say. He goes on to say that it develops, that the gospel generates a new community, and then he explains that a little bit.
The point I'm making is that the New Testament picks up on the notion of character development, but it doesn't happen in terms of what Plato or Aristotle would have seen, which is that virtue is something you work on by yourself and for yourself. Christian virtue is equally about character development, but it begins with the sovereign grace of God in the gospel, hence virtue reborn, and it goes to work precisely as a team sport. The greatest of these is love, says Paul, and you can't do love all by yourself. The gospel is all about the new world which was born through the death and resurrection of Jesus, and which goes to work through the gospel and the Spirit. And as we ponder that new world, that new way of life, which Paul believed the living God was generating and sustaining in these new communities, we become aware of a particular problem, a particular challenge.
So we'll get into that challenge in a minute here, and maybe we'll skip it and go on to something else. But what I think the value of that there is, and what hit me with that is, just as it's amazing how this kind of segued really nicely, is if we're talking about divorce and marriage and things like that, and the people who get divorced and what times that happens, again, individual people's individual stories. And I appreciate those who are giving their stories in the chat here are different, and maybe this doesn't apply to you. But generally speaking, if you're trying to do this religion thing, this holiness thing, this living out the gospel thing by going to church once a month and nobody knows you because you slip in the back and then you leave, that's not going to go very well. And I think that the reason that happens is that, as you know, those who are in church ministry know, we have a really hard time with getting regular churchgoers caring about serving and doing anything else besides going to church on Sunday. It probably has many reasons why, but I think one has to be the idea is Christianity is about getting to heaven rather than acting out heaven here on earth. And that's one of the NT Wright ideas that I really appreciate, is that Jesus brought heaven onto earth. He enacted an actual kingdom, an actual new community of heaven on earth, and that we are to act that out by the power of the Spirit in community with one another.
Yeah, and I think I mentioned this at some stage or another, who knows what broadcast it was on, but I think it's John 13:35-ish. I could have the address wrong, but where it talks about the world will know you're my disciples by the love that you have for one another. So the new community is an evangelistic endeavor to those on the outside. And I recently had this thought in my mind that it's kind of like a thing that I often say, but to your point about punching the ticket for heaven and we're going to go to heaven, even if that's the case, God, if that was the only thing, then when you first believed, God just would have killed you and taken you to be with him. If that was,
that'd be the best thing, right? Because if the purpose is to get there, then get there sooner.
And from my perspective, because I'm the minister or whatever type person, the reason why you're here is to share Jesus with others. If you're not doing that, then what are you here for? There's literally, and I think that, and maybe this is my own bias showing through in terms of the new community and that being an evangelistic endeavor. Even that, the new community, you're going to get that in the resurrected age. So you're not even really here. Like, that's something that we should do, that we need to be obedient to Jesus in. But yeah, anyways, that was my soapbox about that. It's just, and because what you said was it's difficult to get people involved in ministry and laboring and doing things. Right. And it's because we have this rhetoric surrounding things like, well, I'm called to the ministry. And I just don't like that, because on one thing, it creates a laity and minister divide, to where the laity are just saying, yep, he's the minister, he's called, he's the one that does the ministry, and I'm just gonna sit here and listen, and read my Bible or whatever else. And there's also a sense in which it's used as an authority. Well, God called me. He called me here. I'm called to this. Really, like, I think, when it talks about being an overseer, it says if any man aspires to be an overseer. It doesn't use calling language with regards to these very specific, sort of things. That's sort of my soapbox on that. But
no. Are you ready for it? So what NT Wright goes on to say, he goes on to say that Paul saw a problem, and the problem is okay, now that we have this ministry of reconciliation, but how do we stay unified with this? If there's this new ethic, this new character formation, that we are to live out holiness together, that's really difficult. And so how do you get a community to stay committed and to do that? And he says that, and I'll skip ahead just for the sake of time. He says that the Jews had a really good way of doing this, where they had, a Torah, and they had temple worship, and they had the sacrifices. And so they had circumcision and these things that would mark them apart from the rest of the culture. And that kept them unified. But then what's that for the new? Oh my gosh.
So I think Eric's mic has gone out. I think I can still hear you, Eric, like the microphone, but what was I going to say? Well, I think I was just going to tell someone in the chat here something, but maybe I think Eric's going to have to reboot or something. So Q&A time. Yeah. So Kiss the Sun here says, this is a true saying, if a man desire the office of bishop, he desire a good thing. Am I? Okay, good. I'm not muted. Yeah. It's about, and one thing that I've thought about with regards to the calling is that, should I put my big old mug up here so that you guys can see me? There's at the beginning of Habakkuk, I think it uses a word where it says, Habakkuk, the vision, or his vision, or something like that. And the word in the Hebrew is burden or vision. And so I think if someone has a vision and a burden for ministry, then that's what you would call a calling. But I wouldn't use the word calling, because I think that everybody has their role to play, and everybody has their own, gifts to contribute. It's the offices, the apostle, the prophet, the evangelist, the shepherd, and the teacher. Hey, Eric, welcome back. holding it down, that have these uniquely gifted positions that are used to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. Not that those 5 people, the apest, they're the ones doing the work of the ministry. It's just them. They're the called ones. That's not what it says. So that's a good little soapbox to get on while we were waiting on you to tune back in there. So let's get into it.
Let's do it. So yeah, he's going to give his vision for how, and this is, I don't know what to do with this, honestly, as someone who is new to these categories, and I'm not quite sure what to do with NT Wright's view on justification and things like that. I'm open to hearing what you guys think, what you think, Drew. And is this really what Paul was thinking when he was thinking, how do I keep this new community unified?
But Paul had glimpsed in the gospel the fact that Israel's God had now done a radically new thing. Nobody had expected a crucified Messiah. Nobody had expected that resurrection was something that would happen to one person in advance of all the others. Nobody in particular had imagined that when the old prophecies were fulfilled and Abraham's family was suddenly extended to a worldwide gathering from every nation under heaven, that such people would not have to become Jews as well. After all, if they were going to give up worshipping idols and serve a living God, how else could they do it? Of course, they must become Jews. So the central argument of my book, and the one I invite you to consider with me in these days together, is that Paul's worldview, which had this new community of reconciliation at its heart, needed something new, something different, something which would sustain and enhance the life of unity and holiness to which he knew the gospel had called people. And my proposal, which I think quite radically reshapes the way we think about Paul and his ideas, is that Paul effectively invented not just some new theological dogmas, but a new discipline, a task, an activity, which we might with hindsight call Christian theology. Of course, he didn't call it that, but looking back, we can see that's where it began. This discipline was not simply about working out the different dogmas and teaching them to people and showing how they fitted together. It was about teaching people to think in a new way, so that this new thinking as an activity, as well as its new content, would sustain them in the life of unity and holiness to which they were called.
We're doing that right now. We're doing Christian theology right now. So if that's what we're supposed to do in the gospel of reconciliation, to be a community of believers together, at least we're doing it.
You know, Kevin's got one thing for sure here. Kevin says he's a maniac out of control. I don't know what the N stands for. I know it's Tom, but don't agree with everything. Nicholas Tom. I love Nicholas Tom, but don't agree with everything. But I probably would if he just told me to. Just saying he's compelling with that accent.
He can't be wrong when he sounds like that when he talks.
Yeah.
So what do you think about that? If that's his central argument, as he says, his central argument of his book, what do you think about that?
Not gonna lie, I was doing some housekeeping with something that I have happening here in about 20 minutes. So you want to summarize what he said?
He said that the new practice, the new discipline, that isn't just a head thing, it's also a doing thing, as Paul was doing with the runaway slave and reconciling them, a ministry of reconciliation, right? Is that this thing is called Christian theology. That's what the new community should do together and act out together as a way of being unified.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that we've talked about pretty consistently here on this podcast is that ideas have consequences. And the reason why we're so passionate about theology and soteriology and putting this content out there is because we do believe that it affects how we live our Christian lives. And so he's right to say that if this is Christian theology, then perhaps the first question to ask is, do we believe it? And then the second question is to ask, what are we going to do about it? And that's one thing that I try to emphasize in a number of small groups, home groups that I've facilitated and facilitate, is asking the question at the end, okay, now what are you going to do about it? We read all this stuff. We did our theology. We discovered what God has for us in the scriptures. Now, how do we respond to this? How do we obey Christ in this? Because it's all well and good to read something. It's all well and good to come here and to listen to us and to learn some theology and discuss some theology. But what are we going to do about it? You know,
and maybe that thing that we have to do is going to be something that will cause riots, quote unquote, quote fingers, cause riots. That the people aren't going to understand it. And people in your family, people in your community are going to think it's scandalous or nonsense. Maybe that's a prerequisite to know you're putting your finger on the right place.
If you want to be a peculiar person, you go up to somebody that has offended you and say, hey, brother or sister, I just want to say, you said this, and I felt like that was kind of, you want to be peculiar. You want to be countercultural. Start doing that. I mean, learn how to forbear. You shouldn't go. Recently, I was talking to a mentor friend of mine, and something came up, and it was bothering me more than I thought it was. And so I talked to the mentor friend. I said, maybe I should broach this with this person. Maybe I should talk about this because I'm, Matthew 18, 15 to 20. I want to be obedient to this. And he's kind of said, well, just pray about it and, see if it still bothers you after you pray about it. But it might just be something that you can forbear. And then I prayed about it and I thought, this is fine. I'm just going to overlook this. This isn't really necessary. So there is an aspect of that, but we have to pray into that. And we have to be careful of regarding this reconciliation thing to not be tempted to go straight to this unilateral forgiveness of, no, it's fine. I don't need to, I prayed about it and it's fine. Is it? And
then because it's not fine in our hearts, and because we are still hurt by it, we have to, but we don't confront because reconciliation is hard. Confrontation is difficult. You have to be open about your own failures too. If you're confronting, you have to admit your own sins to that person as well. If you're confronting, but we don't do that, but because it still hurts, we talk to others about it and we gossip.
Yeah. And gosh, what was I going to say? Something about one thing that I feel like I've learned in the recent past, maybe 5 to 7 years or so, is that unforgiveness and bitterness is probably, dare I say, the most dangerous thing for the Christian. Maybe second to pride. And I think one of the reasons why we struggle with it so much and why it's a thing is because we don't talk to people about things. We internalize and then we yakka to the person next to us. That's about right. It.
So I'm interested in continuing to explore that idea with NT Wright, and maybe we do it here with all of you. And Drew and I will hash it out. Well, maybe we'll do it in our Discord. Come become a patron and join us at our Discord. And maybe we do it there as we explore some of these ideas here. But then he goes on to say something that I despondingly agree with. And then he addresses some of the controversies that kind of interest us, and it's more of our wheelhouse. So yeah, he goes on to say something I think that we're all gonna agree with here.
And as I'm saying these words in the context of a great seminary from today's church, it seems to me appropriate that we should remind ourselves that theology is not just something you learn as a subject, nor is it just something for the elite core of Christian intellectuals to have fun with as they write books and attend seminars. Christian theology, in the sense I'm meaning it, is a task for the whole church. You know the saying, give someone a fish and you feed them for a day, teach someone to fish and you feed them for life. For Paul, it was like that with theology. Teach someone a doctrine and you may keep them sound for a day. Teach the whole church to think into God's new world, and you will establish the church as the united and holy community bringing glory to God. That is the challenge of Pauline theology.
Right?
Yeah.
How many times do we say that here at the Provisionist perspective, that it's not just for some sort of elite to engage in?
It reminds me of that. This is such a great meme. It's the one where somebody says, "Oh, well, I don't really do theology. I just need Jesus." I'm like, oh yeah, who's Jesus? Well, he's the Son incarnate, the Word made flesh. I think you're doing theology. So theology is this big scary word to just say what we believe about God. And it's important to agree with one of our I don't want to call him counterparts, if you will. The late R.C. Sproul has been known to say every man is a theologian, every Christian's a theologian. And I couldn't agree more. There might be various levels to that in terms of interest and passion. Eric and I are the ones that have taken the red pills and are doing a podcast about it. So obviously we're a little bit more interested and invested maybe than some people are, but we would like everyone to think that this is important enough to talk about. So
see, Peter, that's right. It's the standard of seriousness. It's everybody can do Christian theology. Everybody should do Christian theology. You don't have to be a scholar to do it, right? That is the standard of seriousness, isn't it? That is the same thing. See, I have missed that one. Nice. Well, he addresses some of his controversies here. Tell me what you think about this.
I got about 15 minutes.
Yeah. Let's get it. This is the last little bit that I have.
Cool. I don't know. Just here's a comment out of context. Cows got to eat too, right? I don't even know what that's just, just for your own entertainment and reflection purposes.
I was wondering about that too. Yeah, I don't know.
Just messing with you, Andrew. Just trying to fill some dead air.
Load-bearing for the united and holy community in the Messiah. It is for everyone, from runaway slaves to civic officials, from intellectual snobs to illiterate peasants. It is the activity of minds that are being transformed by the gospel, with that thinking taking its proper human maturing place between worship and action. It is indeed foolishness to the Greeks, scandalous to the Jews, but to those who are being saved, both Jew and Greek, it is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And we who try to follow in Paul's footsteps today, and this I think is one of the most urgent tasks for the church right now, we have a double problem as we try to come to terms with what he's saying. First, there is of course much to learn, but second, there is much to unlearn. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that everything we've been taught about Paul is wrong and we should give it up. Somebody said in an article about me just recently, rather snide remark, I thought, does he really think that everyone got everything wrong until he happened to take up his pen? Of course I don't think that. Give me a break. It is rather that the way the Western church has studied and taught Pauline theology
Calvinist
has, in my view, been put in the wrong frame, and the frame has produced radical distortions. Part of my aim as a first century historian, which is what I basically am, reading Paul, is gently but firmly to take his theology out of that basically Western medieval frame that it's been in for all these centuries and put it instead into the frame of the actual first century context and community where it really belongs. And as we ourselves move rapidly through changing and shift cultures, it simply won't do to go on repeating the things we've been taught within the old frame and hoping somehow that they'll still work. We need a different approach, a fully first century approach. As I've said quite often now, we must stop giving 19th century answers to 16th century questions and start giving 21st century answers to first century questions.
He goes on to say other things like that, but that's what he thinks he's trying to do with the new perspective. And the reason why it's important, as I said at the beginning, not to allow Calvinists to control who you listen to, is that if that's true, Calvinism is wrecked. Calvinism is untenable. If it's true that the reformers and the Protestants hereafter that took 16th century questions and made Paul answer those questions, instead of understanding Paul in his first century context, Calvinism loses all footing.
You got to question everything if that's the case.
Right. And I think that's an amazing, when people are kind of confused, and we get these questions and stuff frequently, confused about where Calvinists are getting this stuff and how can they see things this way. Well, it's very easy. They're taking a particular problem from a particular historical series of events, a time in history that we don't live in anymore, and the church problems that we don't have anymore, and they are making the Bible, and Paul specifically, fit those issues. That's where they're getting this. And if that's not a valid practice, and you'll hear them defend this practice with, well, the Holy Spirit speaks to everyone at all time, right? Well, the God is the author, and are you saying that that the Bible says nothing to us? You know that this criticism is strong when their reply is, so then you're saying the Bible has nothing to do with us at all. Got it.
And we've received that exact same criticism recently from he who shall not be named. He has reverted to that title for me, by the way. And
We
speaking
were
of
saying his
this,
name for a while.
speaking of this issue, speaking of that, there was a response given to Brother Leighton by the Pope of Polemics himself recently, where he made an association with Leighton and this Roman Catholic 16th century issue. And you can't help but think when NT Wright is talking about this stuff that this isn't even, why are you making this about that?
Right.
This is not about that. This has nothing
Yeah.
to do with that. This isn't the Roman Catholic sympathizing synergists. Oh, that's a good. You should feel free to take that one, Sergeant. He who shall not be named. You can have that one. It's free of charge. Roman Catholic sympathizing synergists. Free of charge. I wanted to say this about this can be kind of my hopefully sort of closing thought on this. He talked about, NT Wright used this phrase there at the end about the transforming our minds by the gospel such that our actions, such that we're living it out. We're living out this ministry of reconciliation. So from my perspective, the provisionist perspective, this channel, meaning Generalissimo Black Commander, the strawman armies of the West. Applauso. Perfect. That was great. So back to my more serious. I just had to look over here and see that, didn't I? But it was worth it. It was 100% worth it. Thank you, Andrew, for that. NT Wright, Brother Tom, because we cool like that. I don't what to, Wright, Mr. Wright, Bishop. We're not using the word bishop. He said, transforming our minds by the gospel and the provisionist perspective, this channel, in my mind, it's that I want viewers to be firmly persuaded of God's love and provision for everyone, such that they believe that God loves all unbelievers in the same way. And Christ died for all of them, everyone, and that anyone can be saved. These three things are things that should transform how we have conversations with people, how we share the gospel with people, how we do apologetics, how we do pastoral care. When you're talking to someone and they feel like there's no hope and there's no purpose, say they don't believe in Jesus, can you affirm those three things to them? I feel like that's pretty important. That's, we talk about soteriology 101. People think that this is kind of an issue for the weeds and let's not get into it. Let's all get along and stuff like that. So these three things. God loves everyone. Christ died for everyone, and anyone can be saved. Can we get behind that together? Should we promote that? Should we defend that and refute people that want to come against that? I think we should.
If Paul defines his ministry as a ministry of reconciliation, and if the gospel is a gospel of reconciliation such that it was a heaven-shifting plan to reconcile his creation to him, and then Paul acted that out by reconciling a runaway slave to his slave master, then that should affect not just our evangelism. And can we say that consistently? That's a great point. Can you say that consistently? Can you actually evangelize in that way? But also, can you put reconciliation at the forefront of your Christian practice? That this is what the church should be about. And that touches areas like religion and politics and theology. It touches all those areas, but that something else doesn't become central. Some political concern that it could be the most valid concern in the world. I'm on board with the political concerns of the day and things that are going on. We've had these conversations. I'm on board with that. But perhaps that's not the central thing that the church should be about, talking about it all the time, preaching about it all the time, but instead getting down into the dirty muckety muck of individual Christians' lives and marriages and seeking reconciliation, and really that's what the church discipline is about too, is reconciliation. And making that the forefront of the countercultural thing that the church is all about, that makes people go like, wait, what? You want us to do what? That's ridiculous. And there's less tea parties and more cultural riots, and that's what it's all about.
Amen. So be it. I think it's a great place to end. We'll see you guys next time.
Yeah, we'll see you next time. We'll continue to explore this stuff with NT Wright. We can continue to go through our PROVIDE acronym. If you enjoy this kind of content and you don't want to let the Calvinists control who you listen to, and we put people out there, even if they're Anglican bishops talking at Fuller, which triggers me in all kinds of ways, but they have something good to say about the gospel. They have a valid way of looking at these things, such that we're not using childish tropes like Jesus Jr. in our sermons. If this is something that's valuable to you, so support us, become a patron. Love to see you over there on the Discord. Thank you so much for everyone who tuned in. Have a good night. Drew, go get to that thing you got.
Yeah, I'm going to do it.
And we'll see you next time on the Provisionist Perspective.
Peace.